Daniel Harper noticed the laundry before he noticed anything else, because it was always there before he expected it, waiting quietly outside his apartment door every Thursday evening, a clean white basket with folded shirts on top, warm as if someone had just cared enough to finish the job minutes ago, and at first he thought it was a mistake, maybe another tenant confused the doors. But the label always had his apartment number written neatly in black ink, and after the third week he stopped questioning it and simply brought the clothes inside, because life had taught him not to question small comforts, especially when his days were long and dull, his job in commercial real estate draining his energy, and his marriage settled into a silence that felt permanent rather than temporary, and the laundry became part of that quiet rhythm, something steady in a life that no longer surprised him. Daniel lived in a modest apartment building in Portland, Oregon, the kind with beige walls, old elevators, and a shared laundry room in the basement, and he had lived there with his wife Laura for 5 years, long enough for excitement to fade and routines to harden, and every Thursday he would come home tired, drop his keys on the counter, notice the basket by the door, and feel a small, confusing sense of relief that he never spoke out loud, because it felt foolish to be grateful to someone he had never met, someone who existed only as a name written on a clipboard in the laundry room. Emily Carter, and that name lingered in his mind longer than it should have, not because it meant anything romantic, but because it felt personal, intentional, like someone had chosen him specifically, and that feeling stayed with him more than he liked to admit. Daniel was not unhappy in a dramatic way. There were no shouting matches or slammed doors at home, just long evenings where he and Laura sat on opposite ends of the couch scrolling through their phones, exchanging updates about bills or grocery lists instead of feelings, and he told himself this was normal, this was adulthood, this was marriage after the spark faded. Yet every time he unfolded a clean shirt that he didn't remember washing, something inside him tightened, because someone had touched his life without asking anything in return, and that felt unfamiliar and strangely intimate. He tried once to leave a note on the basket, a simple thank you, but the next week the basket appeared again with the note removed, the clothes folded even more neatly, as if gratitude was accepted but distance was required, and that made him curious, not in a reckless way, but in a human way. The way people become curious about stories they are not supposed to read, and he found himself thinking about Emily Carter as he drove to work, wondering who she was, why she did this, whether she was old or young, cheerful or lonely, and most of all, why she chose him, because there were many other apartments in the building, many other lives equally ordinary, and yet she had chosen his. The curiosity stayed quiet, controlled, until one Thursday when Daniel came home earlier than usual, his meeting cancelled. The sky still bright outside, and as he unlocked his door, he noticed the laundry basket was not there, and for the first time in months, he felt a sharp, irrational disappointment, like something promised had been taken away, and he stood there longer than necessary, staring at the empty hallway, listening to the hum of the building, telling himself not to be ridiculous, when suddenly he heard footsteps behind him, soft and unhurried, and a voice said, "Oh, sorry, I was just about to leave this," and Daniel turned, surprised, and there she was, holding the basket, standing closer than he expected, close enough that he could see the faint lines around her eyes, the calm steadiness in her face, and the kindness that seemed practiced but genuine. Emily Carter was not striking in a dramatic way, but there was something grounding about her presence, something that made the hallway feel quieter, and she smiled politely, not flirtatiously, as if this moment had been inevitable and unimportant at the same time. And she apologized for being late, explaining simply that the machines were busy earlier, and Daniel nodded too quickly, thanked her too much, his words tumbling over each other because he hadn't prepared for this, because for months she had been a name and a habit, not a real person with a voice. And as she handed him the basket, one sock slipped out and landed between them, and Daniel bent down to pick it up, feeling foolish, and when he stood again, he met her eyes fully for the first time, and something unspoken passed between them, not desire, not betrayal, but recognition, the quiet awareness of two adults who knew loneliness in different ways, and the moment lasted only a second, but it felt longer, heavier, like the start of a sentence that neither of them finished. Emily stepped back politely, wished him a good evening, and walked toward the stairs, leaving Daniel standing there with his laundry and a strange tightness in his chest, and as he closed the door behind him, he realized that nothing physical had happened, nothing improper, nothing he could explain or confess, yet something had shifted, because for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt seen, not as a husband, not as a worker, not as a role he played, but simply as himself, and that realization unsettled him more than temptation ever could, because it hinted at something missing in his life that he had been avoiding, and as he folded the clothes that night, he noticed how carefully they were arranged, how each item seemed placed with intention, and he wondered when routine had turned into meaning, when a small kindness had begun to matter so much, and whether he had already stepped onto a path that would force him to confront truths he wasn't ready to face, because the laundry was no longer just laundry, and Emily Carter was no longer just a name on a clipboard, and deep down, Daniel knew that from this moment on, Thursdays would never feel the same again. After that first meeting, Daniel tried to return to his normal rhythm, but the quiet order of his life no longer felt complete, because now the laundry came with a face, a voice, and a presence that lingered in his thoughts longer than he wanted, and the following Thursday he did not wait behind his door but went down to the basement laundry room, telling himself he only needed detergent, when in truth he wanted to understand the mystery he had ignored for months, and there he found Emily sorting clothes with steady hands, moving with the calm focus of someone who had turned routine into comfort, and she greeted him with the same polite smile as before, no surprise, no awkwardness, as if seeing him there made sense, and they spoke in short sentences at first, about broken dryers and rising utility costs, about how the building always smelled faintly of soap, and Daniel noticed how easy it felt to talk to her, how she listened without rushing him, how her attention felt undivided in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Emily explained simply that she did laundry late at night because it helped her sleep, that after her husband passed away routine became a way to keep time moving forward, and she admitted she had noticed Daniel always forgetting his laundry or leaving it overnight, so she started folding it, then washing it, never thinking it would matter so much, and Daniel felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment, realizing how much of his life he moved through without noticing the people around him. And as they talked he learned she worked part-time at a local library, lived alone 2 floors up, and preferred quiet evenings to crowded rooms, and none of it felt dramatic, yet every detail settled gently into his mind as if it belonged there. Days passed, then weeks, and their conversations grew longer but stayed careful, never crossing into dangerous territory, always balanced between friendliness and restraint, meeting briefly in hallways or by the mailboxes, sharing small observations about the weather, a book Emily was reading, a project Daniel was stuck on at work, and Daniel began to notice how these moments softened him, how he felt lighter afterward, more present, and at home he found himself noticing the silence more clearly, the way Laura moved through the apartment like a roommate rather than a partner, their conversations reduced to schedules and shared responsibilities, and he hated himself for comparing the two, because Emily had done nothing wrong, had asked for nothing, yet her quiet attention made the emptiness at home harder to ignore. One evening, Daniel forgot his jacket in the laundry room, and Emily brought it to his door with the same calm care she showed everything else, and they stood there talking longer than usual, the hallway dim and quiet, and Emily mentioned she used to cook big dinners before her husband passed, that now she cooked small meals because it felt strange to cook for one, and Daniel felt a sudden ache he didn't know how to respond to, because grief and loneliness were not things he knew how to fix, only recognize. And in that moment he realized she wasn't trying to fill a space in his life, she was simply living with the space in hers, and that understanding made him respect her more. The tension did not arrive loudly, it built slowly, like pressure under still water, in the way Daniel looked forward to seeing her, in the way he found himself choosing his words more carefully around her, wanting to be honest but safe, and Emily sensed it too, because she began to keep a little more distance, ending conversations gently, stepping back before moments could grow heavy, and Daniel understood that restraint was her way of protecting both of them, yet it also made him realize how close he already felt to her without meaning to, how emotional closeness could form without touch or intention. The turning point came during a sudden power outage one evening, when the building fell into darkness and the hum of everyday noise disappeared, and Daniel, uneasy in the silence, stepped into the hallway where emergency lights cast long shadows, and he saw Emily sitting on the stairwell, her phone flashlight resting beside her, and without planning it he joined her, sitting at a careful distance, and they talked in the dark about simple things at first, then deeper ones, Emily sharing how nights were the hardest, how the quiet made memories louder, and Daniel admitting, in a voice lower than usual, that he felt invisible in his own home, that he wasn't angry or mistreated, just unseen, and Emily listened without interruption, without judgment, her presence steady, and when he finished she did not offer advice. She only said she understood, and that single sentence landed harder than comfort ever had, because it meant his feelings were real, not selfish or imagined. When the lights came back on, the moment ended naturally, and they stood, nodded, and went their separate ways. But Daniel walked back to his apartment with his heart beating faster than normal, aware that something had shifted again, not because anything improper had happened, but because he had allowed himself to be honest with someone who was not his wife, and that truth unsettled him deeply, because he could no longer pretend that this connection was harmless or accidental. And as he lay in bed that night listening to Laura's steady breathing, he stared at the ceiling and understood that the mystery was no longer about why Emily did his laundry, but about why her presence now mattered so much, and whether he had the courage to face what that meant for his marriage, his choices, and the quiet life he had been drifting through without question. The tension between Daniel and Emily grew quietly but unmistakably over the weeks, a subtle pull that neither of them named but both felt, and it first hit in a way he didn't expect during a Friday evening when a sudden rainstorm trapped him in the building's hallway, and he ran into Emily near the stairwell, both soaked slightly from the few steps outside, and the awkwardness broke instantly into laughter, sharp, unexpected, freeing laughter that echoed softly off the walls and made Daniel realize how much he had missed simple joy. They decided to wait out the rain on the landing, sitting on the concrete steps, close enough to feel warmth from proximity but far enough to respect invisible boundaries, and the conversation started with mundane things, the storm, the old building, the mail system, but gradually shifted, as it always did, to something deeper, quieter, more intimate, with Emily speaking softly about her late husband, how silence had filled rooms after his death, how routine became her lifeline, and Daniel, surprised at his own willingness, began to speak too, confessing that his marriage felt hollow, not bad, not angry, just absent, and that he often felt like a guest in his own life. Her eyes, steady and calm, met his as he spoke, and in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt in years, truly being seen, truly being heard without judgment, and it hit him harder than he expected, because he had not only longed for attention, but for understanding, and Emily gave it freely, without expectation, without manipulation, without crossing lines, and that honesty unsettled him, made him aware of the empty spaces in his home, in his marriage, in his life, and yet he didn't feel guilty, not exactly, only aware, because nothing physical happened, no hands brushed, no whispers exchanged, only words, only glances, only presence. The power outage ended, leaving the hallway dim but illuminated by emergency lights, and when they stood to part ways, the tension hung in the air like unspoken words, heavy but not threatening, and Daniel walked back to his apartment, soaked, shivering slightly, but with his chest strangely warm, aware that something significant had begun without a single touch, a single confession, a single leap into what most people call danger, and the feeling stayed with him, unrelenting, persistent, because it forced him to confront the truth he had avoided for months, that he longed for connection in ways his routine life could not provide. At home, he found Laura in the living room, reading quietly, unaware of the storm outside and completely unaware of the emotional storm raging within him, and he realized with sudden clarity how much he had been drifting, how much the absence of attentiveness had made him hungry for something human, something kind, something real, and he felt no resentment toward her, only a stark awareness that love is not always active, that presence is not always enough, and that sometimes people simply stop seeing each other without meaning to. Over the next days, Daniel found himself thinking about Emily constantly, replaying her words, her calm voice, her measured attention, the way she had listened without interruption, the way she had acknowledged his feelings without offering solutions, and he noticed how small habits became larger in significance, how she remembered the way he liked his shirts folded, how she left little notes when she noticed a missing button or a shrinking sweater, and it was not the acts themselves but the intention behind them that touched him, that made his evenings feel lighter, that made him anticipate Thursdays in a way that frightened and thrilled him at once. He caught himself smiling at nothing, imagining running into her in the hallway, imagining the quiet security of sitting on the stairwell and talking about nothing important, yet feeling everything at the same time, and the more he thought, the more he realized this was not about temptation, not about wanting to betray, but about experiencing what had been missing, what had been neglected, the human need to be acknowledged, understood, valued, and the way Emily provided that in the smallest, simplest of gestures. And Daniel began to understand that emotional attraction could be as strong, as consuming, as physical attraction, and perhaps more dangerous because it left no evidence, only a stirring inside that could not be contained. One evening, as he folded the laundry she had delivered, he caught himself tracing the pattern of the folds with his eyes, remembering her words from the stairwell, remembering the gentle tone, the small details she had shared about her life, and he realized that his thoughts of her were growing more detailed, more intimate, but still safe, still clean, yet no less powerful. And that frightened him because he knew boundaries were being tested without either of them realizing it, and that emotional tension was a slow, creeping force, not an abrupt temptation. Daniel started noticing the quiet contrast between Emily and Laura more acutely, how Emily's presence filled spaces with calm attention while his wife filled spaces with routine, and he hated himself for the comparison, for recognizing the deficit in his own marriage, and yet he could not turn away, because Emily's influence was subtle, patient, understanding, never demanding, and he began to realize that this slow, emotional connection was more intoxicating than any brief flirtation, because it made him want to be a better version of himself, made him want to communicate, to express, to notice, to care in ways he had forgotten existed. Every Thursday, every brief hallway encounter, every conversation about the weather or small chores became laden with meaning, a quiet signal of emotional intimacy, and Daniel began to understand that the bond forming was not reckless but real, that the foundation of attraction was not physical but emotional, and that realization left him both exhilarated and terrified, because he had never felt anything like this, and he knew that acknowledging it could change everything, challenge everything, and yet he could not ignore it. Emily's presence began to awaken in him a sense of living again, of noticing, of engaging, small acts of kindness, small exchanges of words, small moments that had been missing for years, and Daniel understood that this was more than neighborly attention, more than polite gestures, more than curiosity. It was a bridge to what he had lost, a mirror to his loneliness, and a reminder that human connection was not guaranteed, that it must be nurtured, recognized, felt, and that sometimes it came from the most unexpected places. The emotional tension was steady, unrelenting, a force that neither asked for permission nor broke rules, yet left its mark on his consciousness, changing how he saw the world, changing how he walked through the apartment hallways, changing how he noticed the details of life and the depth of absence in his home, and Daniel realized with a sudden clarity that this bond with Emily was not a fleeting thought but a presence shaping him, shaping his days, shaping his awareness of himself, and that awareness carried a sweetness and a sorrow at once, because he knew the connection was beautiful and human, yet it existed in a space that demanded restraint, reflection, and careful thought. By the end of the week, Daniel felt an unfamiliar energy coursing through him, a mixture of hope and longing, a subtle, persistent heartbeat of curiosity and desire, not for Emily herself in a physical way, but for the awareness she brought, the recognition, the acknowledgement, the emotional clarity, and he understood that this connection, growing slowly and quietly, had already begun to redefine how he viewed relationships, attention, and intimacy, teaching him that emotional closeness could be more powerful than any overt act, more profound than any planned encounter, and he knew he had to navigate it carefully, because the beauty of it was in its restraint, its subtlety, and the way it forced him to confront feelings he had long ignored, setting the stage for the choices, consequences, and revelations that were inevitably coming in his life. The truth hit Daniel like a sudden, cold wind one evening when he came home earlier than usual and found Laura sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug, her phone face down beside her, and her calm, steady gaze immediately told him something was different, and before he could speak, she said, "I know about Emily," and the words struck harder than any accusation, softer than any anger, yet heavier than he expected, because she didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't accuse him of betrayal. She simply stated a fact that made the room feel smaller, and Daniel froze, unsure whether to defend himself, apologize, or retreat into silence, and Laura continued, explaining that she hadn't discovered a physical affair, that he had done nothing wrong in action, but in presence and in heart. He had already drifted, had already sought what she could not give, and the clarity in her voice made it impossible to argue, impossible to ignore, impossible to continue the comfortable illusions they had both clung to for years. She told him she had noticed subtle changes months ago, how he smiled at his phone, how Thursdays suddenly carried weight in his step, how his attention lingered outside their marriage, and Daniel realized she had been watching all along, quietly, without confrontation, without anger, simply observing, and the pain of knowing he had been seen without realizing it before hit him harder than he could have imagined, because it stripped away excuses, justifications, and defenses, leaving only raw awareness of his own loneliness and the emptiness that had allowed an emotional bond with another person to grow unnoticed. Laura admitted with a quiet, measured tone that she herself had felt the distance long before him, that their marriage had become practical rather than passionate, routine rather than alive, and that she too had stopped seeing him fully, stopped noticing him in ways she used to, and Daniel realized the truth in her words, that emotional drift is not always the fault of one partner, but often a silent, mutual erosion, and this realization, though painful, offered clarity, because it exposed the cracks he had avoided acknowledging. For the first time, Daniel understood that what he felt for Emily was not betrayal in the usual sense, but a mirror, reflecting the emotional void in his marriage, and Laura's calm acknowledgement of that reality forced him to confront not just the risk of attachment, but the consequences of neglect, the long-term cost of unspoken needs, and the human need for attention, understanding, and emotional validation, which he had been seeking outside while it had quietly faded at home. He felt a mix of guilt, relief, and awakening, because Laura's words were not punitive, but honest, and honesty, he realized, was the hardest truth of all, harder than temptation, harder than confrontation, because it demanded self-reflection, and he sat down across from her, feeling the weight of years of silence, missed opportunities, and unnoticed gestures, and for the first time, they spoke openly, carefully, painfully, about what had been missing, about what they had ignored, about what each had needed but not received, and Daniel discovered that acknowledgement itself could hurt and heal simultaneously, opening a space for clarity that had been absent in their marriage for years. Laura explained that she did not want to punish him, that she was not angry at Emily, that she understood the human need for connection, that she had lived through her own quiet loneliness while he had lived through his, and that mutual awareness, though painful, might allow them to rebuild, to reconsider, to face the reality they had been avoiding. And Daniel, listening, realized that this confrontation, quiet yet devastating, offered an unexpected gift, a chance to confront his own choices, to accept responsibility, and to decide whether to stay, to repair, or to leave, and that decision, though not yet made, would be informed by truth rather than habit. The room felt different after that conversation, charged with awareness, and Daniel walked through the apartment slowly, noticing the details he had ignored for years, the way Laura's mug was chipped, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her hands rested on the table, calm but deliberate. And he recognized the depth of his inattention, the subtle erosion of intimacy, the quiet ways love fades without notice, and he felt a pang of sorrow for the time lost, for the distance allowed to grow, for the walls they had both built without realizing. In the following days, he found himself thinking less about Emily in terms of desire and more in terms of revelation, realizing that she had been a catalyst, a mirror reflecting not attraction but absence, and that the bond he had felt was not inherently wrong, but a symptom of neglect, of unmet needs, of quiet loneliness, and that understanding changed everything, reframing his weeks of anticipation, his emotional stirrings, into lessons about attention, care, and emotional presence, and he began to see that love and fidelity were not only about physical boundaries, but about awareness, engagement, and honesty. Daniel noticed subtle shifts in himself. He listened more carefully to Laura, asked questions he had forgotten to ask, noticed her gestures, her routines, her silences, and he realized that emotional presence required effort, mindfulness, and courage, and that the simple act of noticing could rebuild bridges that had been quietly eroding for years. And in that awareness, he found both hope and fear, hope that they could reconnect, and fear that time lost could not be fully recovered, and that some of the gaps would remain, because neglect leaves traces even after awareness returns. The impact of Emily's presence was no longer about temptation or potential infidelity, but about clarity. She had illuminated the emotional absence at home, and Daniel understood that without her intervention, subtle or not, he might never have seen the truth, and that awareness carried weight, responsibility, and consequences, forcing him to consider what kind of husband he wanted to be, what kind of man he wanted to be, and whether he could face the discomfort of repairing what had been neglected for so long. In quiet moments, Daniel reflected on his reactions, realizing that his initial excitement and emotional attachment to Emily was less about desire and more about the human need to be seen, and Laura's revelation crystallized that truth, showing him the mirror of his own inattention, and he felt both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the ways he had failed to nurture the relationship that mattered most, and gratitude that awareness had arrived before anything irreversible had occurred, and that recognition, though painful, offered a chance for change. He began to imagine conversations with Laura that he had avoided for years, envisioning honesty, vulnerability, and acknowledgement of needs, and realized that rebuilding would not be easy, that it required courage to face emotional discomfort. Yet he felt a quiet determination, because knowing the truth about himself and his marriage allowed him to act rather than drift, to confront rather than ignore, and that clarity was more powerful than any fleeting emotion he had felt with Emily. Daniel also recognized that Emily's role in this story was never about betrayal, temptation, or scandal, but about reflection, emotional honesty, and careful boundaries, and that realization made him respect her even more, because she had never asked for anything, never crossed a line, and had always maintained distance, allowing him to discover his own emotional truth without blame or manipulation, and that subtle guidance, so quiet and gentle, had become a turning point in his life, shaping his understanding of relationships, responsibility, and emotional presence. As the days went on, Daniel noticed a shift in how he viewed Thursdays, how he viewed the laundry, how he viewed Emily, not as a threat or temptation, but as a mirror reflecting the emotional gaps in his life, the absence of attention, and the need for honesty in every relationship. And that awareness was both liberating and daunting, because it meant confronting emotions long buried, making choices long avoided, and accepting that clarity sometimes comes through indirect, unexpected channels. By the end of the week, Daniel felt a strange mixture of relief, fear, and awakening, understanding that the story of Emily was not about what he had or had not done, but about what he had failed to notice, about the quiet erosion of intimacy over time, and that confronting these truths required courage, mindfulness, and emotional honesty, lessons he would carry forward, whether his marriage survived or changed. And he understood finally that emotional infidelity does not always begin with desire. Sometimes it begins with absence, neglect, and the sudden, undeniable awareness that human beings need to see and be seen, and that awareness, though painful, is the first step toward rebuilding, reconciliation, or moving forward with honesty. The following Thursday, Daniel walked to Emily's door with a mixture of apprehension, relief, and clarity, knowing he had to face the emotional consequences of the past weeks. And when she opened the door with her calm, familiar smile, he felt the full weight of everything unspoken between them, the shared glances, the quiet conversations, the hours of understanding without action, and he began to speak immediately, telling her everything he had withheld from Laura, the drift in his marriage, the loneliness he had felt, the way he had almost let their emotional bond become more than words. And Emily listened quietly, her eyes steady, compassionate, and completely present, neither judging nor encouraging, just holding space for him to speak the truth. And that honesty itself was more powerful than any gesture, more grounding than any touch could have been, because it forced him to confront his feelings, to articulate what he had been avoiding, and to acknowledge the responsibility he carried for his own emotional life. Daniel admitted that he had come close to losing himself in the comfort she provided, that the connection had revealed truths about his life he had not wanted to see, and that he realized now how fragile trust, love, and attention could be if neglected. And Emily responded simply, gently, without drama, saying she had always known this moment would come, that she had never wanted to be an escape for him, that her role had been to offer care without expectation, and that she was proud of him for facing the truth rather than hiding from it. And her words struck him with a strange mixture of comfort and sorrow, because they were both gentle and final, affirming and boundary-setting. Showing him the power of emotional honesty without attachment, she handed him a small bag with his freshly folded clothes, as she had every Thursday, and said softly, "I think this is where it ends." And Daniel understood immediately that the story of them, however meaningful, had always been about clarity and reflection, not romance or possession, and that she had given him the chance to see himself clearly, to confront his marriage, and to understand his own heart without leading him astray. And he felt gratitude deeper than he had expected, mixed with a quiet ache for what could never be, a reminder that human connection often teaches without delivering exactly what the heart wants, and that emotional truth can be both liberating and painful. Walking away from her apartment, Daniel thought about the weeks of anticipation, the laughter in the hallway, the long talks during the storm, the stolen moments of recognition, and realized that Emily's presence had changed him profoundly. Not by taking from his life, but by illuminating it, revealing where neglect had grown, where attention had faded, where love had become routine. And he felt an unfamiliar courage rising within him, the courage to face Laura honestly, to speak the words he had long avoided, to rebuild or reimagine his marriage with awareness rather than habit. And that courage was a gift more lasting than any fleeting connection, more meaningful than any comfort he had sought in emotional proximity. When he returned home, he found Laura waiting, and instead of pretending everything was normal, he spoke openly about his feelings, about the distance he had felt, about the ways he had unintentionally drifted, and about how Emily's presence had revealed truths he could no longer ignore, and Laura listened with the same honesty she had shown weeks before, and together, for the first time in a long while, they began to speak about their needs, their expectations, the small ways they had stopped noticing each other, and the ways they could begin again, acknowledging pain without blame, recognizing absence without anger, and allowing themselves to face reality with empathy and care. In the following days, Daniel noticed subtle changes in himself, in his attentiveness, in his willingness to engage, to observe, to nurture, and he realized that Emily's influence would remain with him not as temptation or regret, but as a reminder that human connection requires presence, honesty, and recognition, that emotional bonds can awaken awareness without crossing boundaries, and that life often teaches its most important lessons through unexpected people who illuminate truth rather than satisfy desire. He found himself cherishing simple moments with Laura, listening more carefully, speaking more openly, noticing her routines and preferences, and feeling a quiet satisfaction in rebuilding a tension that had faded over years, while also feeling the lingering weight of what Emily had represented, a mirror to his loneliness, a guide to self-reflection, a reminder that being truly seen is rare, precious, and transformative, and that the deepest emotional lessons often come from those who never overstep, who offer clarity through care, and who step back gracefully once their work is done. Daniel also reflected on the Thursday rituals, on the small gestures of folded shirts, notes left with gentle care, on how someone who never asked for anything could still change a life profoundly, and he understood that emotional intimacy is not measured by physical proximity but by attentiveness, empathy, and quiet support, and that Emily had provided all of that without expectation, teaching him about boundaries, honesty, and the human need to be acknowledged. As weeks turned into months, Daniel and Laura continued to navigate their relationship with renewed awareness, addressing long-ignored gaps, rebuilding trust and communication, and Daniel felt a calm sense of purpose, knowing that mistakes had been avoided not by luck but by honesty and restraint, and that Emily's role in their lives was a quiet, unspoken gift, a turning point that allowed him to face his own shortcomings, recognize neglected spaces, and commit to meaningful presence. In quiet moments, Daniel often thought of Emily with gratitude rather than longing, understanding that her presence had changed him not by offering romance but by offering clarity, not by tempting him but by revealing truth. And that realization brought a profound sense of emotional maturity, awareness, and humility, because sometimes the person who changes your life most profoundly is not the one you end up with, but the one who makes you see yourself, see your choices, and see the spaces you have left unfilled, and that awareness, though painful at times, shapes the future in ways nothing else can. In the end, Daniel understood that life is less about what you acquire and more about what you recognize, less about fleeting desire and more about enduring honesty, less about physical proximity and more about emotional presence, and that sometimes the most meaningful love stories are not ones of touch or union, but of awakening, reflection, and the courage to face yourself, your relationships, and the life you are building. And as he folded the final shirt from Emily's basket, he smiled softly, feeling seen, changed, and ready to move forward, carrying the lessons she had imparted quietly, powerfully, and irrevocably into the next chapter of his life.